Hey everyone, it's Mr. Thacker. Today we're going to be working on perspective sketching. So in today's lesson, what we're looking at is the proper setup and layout of using the one-point perspective to create some of the objects that we've created in the past via isometric sketching and oblique sketching. So what we need to do first is figure out the problems that we're going to do and then also determine their dimensions. So what we're going to do is we're going to do P1, so P for perspective, so we'll write this down on our sheet, P1. We'll do P2 over here to the right, P3 bottom left, and then P10, okay? And so these will give you guys the application process techniques necessary for creating in a very basic way a one-point perspective. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at we're gonna work on P2 just like we've been using problem number 2 for both our isometrics and also our obliques. We're going to use it also for the perspective sketching for today. So anyway, I'll demonstrate this one. I'll also demonstrate P10, and then we'll kind of go from there. All right, so to start out with, we need to know the dimensions. There they are. We've already got those determined because we've been using this problem multiple times. Also, we want to set up or establish our axes so that we can follow through our 4-step method for creating our object. Okay, so I'm going to move that out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and begin to create our axes. So the X runs to the left, the Y vertically, okay, and the Z, this is the tricky one, okay? So in the case of isometric, we know that the Z goes off at 30, as does the X. We know that in oblique, the Z goes off at a 45, and then in perspective, it all depends on where your vanishing point is, okay? And so what I've done is I've created a vanishing point for you guys as well as an origin. So this is the origin, this is the vanishing point. And so everything going back from the front edge of the object, everything going in the depth dimension is going to recede back to that vanishing point. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw that. This particular line is going to represent my z-axis, and for the accuracy of creating these objects, it's going to be important that you only measure the depth on this axis. So you'll see that applied as I create this object, okay? Also, it's important to note that with respect to the angle is not going to be consistent. So this is not going to be the consistent angle of everything that goes back to this point, because if every edge or corner goes back to this point, the angles are going to vary, okay? And there's a few other things that I'll need to note as we go along. So definitely a significant difference between this and our isometric and oblique. And this is the more realistic of the 3 sketches. Remember, there are different types of a perspective sketch, and the last type, the 3-point perspective, is the most realistic because that's the way we see things in the real world. But it is by far the most difficult of all pictorial sketching to create. So that being said, what we want to do is box the object, and we know that it is 10 wide, okay? It is 6 blocks in height, okay? And since on one point, and this is only true for 1-point perspective of the 3 perspective types, it's like oblique in that everything that's drawn on the front is true shape and size, okay? So don't confuse this with an oblique. Perspectives are not obliques and vice versa. However, a 1-point is a little bit like an oblique in that everything on the front is true shape and size, and that's part of the reason why we're doing 1-point, because it's much easier than 2-point or 3-point. Okay, much easier. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take our corners, and I box the front view, okay? But that's not boxing the object. I've still got to fully box the object, I've got to have the 3rd dimension, okay? So the depth, which I've yet to determine, is going to be determined by what we see right here, okay? It's going to be 2 blocks deep. Now, how do we determine 2 blocks deep? The way I'm going to tell you that we're going to determine 2 blocks deep is that we're going to count back along this z-axis, all right, every vertical line. So right there's 1, right there is 2. So right there is going to be our mark. And before we do anything from that mark, what we're going to do is we're going to take these back. Now, it's going to be important that you use a ruler because it's very hard to draw a straight line, especially when the grid is kind of distracting from each of the corners. So you don't have to take all the lines all the way back. As you can see, I didn't do here. All right, you can just take them some of the way back, but you need to take them farther than they need to go. Okay, so I'll just take those back like so. The z-axis I took all the way back just to define it more clearly. So from this point now I can drag it up. You can see it's on that grid line, so I can drag it up and it's going to create a point here, which I need to draw. So this line is parallel to y. I'm going to need to draw this line parallel to x because it represents the front, which the front and the back should be parallel to each other in a rectangular prism. Okay, so there's that line. Okay, now I have boxed my object in 3D. So what I want to do is move on to the next step, which is to establish the shape. And as we've talked about before, the shape of this object is a rectangular prism. Okay, and so we've got the shape. So next we'll look at the details, and the details is this little rectangular prism up front, and then we'll draw the one in the back. So the one in the front, 5 wide, 4 in height. So we'll go 5 wide, make a mark. You can go ahead and make the line, right? And then 4 in height, and we'll make that line, okay? And what you want to do is you want to take those corners back to the vanishing point as well to make it 3D. So everything, in order to make it 3D, has to go back to the vanishing point if you can see it. So 3 of the 4 corners need to go back to the vanishing point. Sometimes we have to take even one we can't see back to help us to construct properly the perspective. But in this case, that's not necessary. So I'll take these back, but I'm not going to take them all the way back because the further I take them back, the more confusing this process gets. So I'll just take them back towards it, line it up. And the better you line it up, the more accurate your sketch is going to turn out. So this is the only instance, perspective is the only instance where we kind of cheat and we employ the use of a straight edge, also known as a ruler or scale. All right, so how far back does this go? Well, the answer comes from over here where we would, on the z-axis, where we would work out the depth, okay? So the depth is half that distance. So that would be approximately right in there, about half that distance. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that edge over, that point over, and right there we're going to say is the back edge of that box. And then we'll take that point up, okay, and want to make it parallel with my grid, right? So maybe that point's a little bit off my grid, maybe it's not, it's hard to say. But again, this is not the absolutely correct way of doing a one-point perspective. This is just simplifying the method to make it as easy as possible to get a representation a one-point perspective representation of an object. All right, so right there represents the back edge of that detail. And then to finish this off, we can either go, we've already got a line here to here. We could go from this corner and go up and then work back. I'll just start from this point here, okay? I'm a little bit off of this grid, so I'll try to be consistent. And you can see I'm a little bit off of this grid. It's very hard. It'd be nice to be able to follow that grid precisely. Right, brings me to a point right there, which I'll drop down. And if done well, this will all line up, okay? So it's very challenging. You can be off just a little bit here and there. And that's one of the challenges of doing a one-point perspective. So what I'm going to do, or any perspective, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and begin to darken this object. So I'll darken the detail first. And because in perspective things look larger as when they are closer to you, then this detail looks larger or deeper than does the rectangular prism behind it, okay? Which isn't true in reality, but that's the way our eye sees things. If you have, like, you know, if you look down the interstate, it gets smaller the further it gets away from you. If that were to truly happen, we'd have some real issues as far as driving on the interstate. And be careful as you darken the object to only darken what needs to be darkened. And in the end, you'll have a 1-point perspective of problem number 2. Okay, and that's what it should look like. Render once, you can go in and render it like I'm going to do right here. Right, I'll go ahead and kind of changing my angle as I go, if you notice a little bit. All right, I'll do the same here. And so let's go ahead and render the rest of the shape. And I'll leave the front kind of lighter and go darker so I can make this look more three-dimensional. Okay, and you can kind of see how it looks somewhat 3D in the shading application. Okay, so that's P2. Let's move on to P10. P10 is a little more challenging, so I will create another video for P10. Okay, take care.